Hi guys, welcome to Love and Lust Audiobooks channel, updated daily with great audiobooks, so please subscribe to me if you don't want to miss it. Well, let's go to read this book, The Alpha's Orphaned Mate, Part 3, Chapter 21 to 30. Chapter 21. The next morning, I lay on my side, listening to the water poured out of the shower in the adjoining bathroom. I looked through the window down at the packmates beginning their daily routine. When I saw Charles pass by, the water stopped running, and soon after, Gabe opened the door to begin getting dressed. Once again, he had to get an early start. I had no doubt that it was at least partly due to dealing with Charles's outburst from last night. I couldn't work out exactly why those two were a constant presence around Gabe. They seemed to feel entitled to his time and attention. "Why do you put up with Charles and Nestled?" I asked. At first, I thought that he wasn't going to answer me. I would have accepted that. It was a nosy question for me to ask. Gabe buttoned his shirt and sighed. "I owe them a debt," he said. He sat behind me and pulled me into his arms. I relaxed against his chest and held onto his hand. "My father was an alpha too," he said softly. "Our pack was attacked by another. They were our friends, our closest ally. They were called the Bear Lake Pack. For generations, they had been loyal. Our packs were connected by innumerable marriages, and we often celebrated festivals together. We were more like one big pack than two separate ones." The nostalgia in Gabe's voice was impossible to miss. I leaned back against him and wished I could see his face. He was probably holding me this way to make sure that I couldn't. "What happened?" I asked softly. "One day when I was about 3 years old, they attacked us. There was no warning and no one knew why. It was a vicious, frenzied assault." He stopped suddenly. I squeezed his hand and waited. After a few moments, he continued, "My parents died. A lot of people died. Our pack could have fallen apart. That's what happened to the Bear Lake Pack. All order was lost, and they were sent scattering to the wind. I don't know much about what happened to them. Many became rogues. There are rumors that there's still a pack settlement on an island near their old home. I don't know for sure." He shook his head as if to shake the thoughts away. "I was far too young to be a leader, and there was no one else the pack could turn to, except for Charles. He was my father's beta, and he took me in. He helped me to lead and gave the pack some stability in the aftermath of the attack. Not everyone stayed, but many did. Eventually, we were able to recover," he said. "Charles oversteps and often irritates me, but I can't ignore the sacrifices he made to protect this pack. To protect me." I nodded slowly. "That's an incredible amount of responsibility for a child," I said softly. He made a non-committal sound and squeezed me a little tighter. "There's nothing special about my experience," he said. He sounded far away, and I wished I could see him. "Everyone in the pack has their own story of loss. You're no exception to that." "I guess so," I said. "I don't know if it counts as a loss. I never knew my parents." "I don't know anything about them. It's more of an absence than a loss. Maybe that's why Charles's words had made me so angry last night." I couldn't defend myself from the accusations because I didn't know what the truth was. "You don't know anything?" he asked. Judging by his tone, he'd been wanting to ask for a long time. I shook my head. "I was surrendered to a hospital when I was born. I don't even know exactly when my birthday is." I smiled bitterly. "It's hard having so much focus on that part of my life," I said softly. "I don't understand why Charles is so hung up on it." Gabe made a thoughtful sound and loosened his grip so that I could turn in his arms. "He's protective of the pack." "It feels like there's more to it than that," I said. "What do you mean?" I looked at him and tried to decide if I should keep talking. Last night, he told me to come to him when I was upset or afraid. Charles scared me. He looked at me like I was beneath him. But there was something else, something that I couldn't name. He makes me uncomfortable, I said softly. Gabe stroked my hair and frowned. How so? I don't really know how to describe it. I said, I'm on high alert when he's near me. It feels like I can't relax. There's something about him that just feels threatening. You're on high alert, he repeated thoughtfully. My instincts tell me not to trust him. Gabe was doing his best to keep his face neutral, but I could see the distress the statement caused him. I wish that I could take it back. You should trust your instincts, she said softly. I don't mean to imply anything, I said quickly. I know that Charles is important to you. I hadn't seen an expression like this on Gabe's face before, and I immediately felt guilty for causing it. His brows were pinched as if he were in pain, and he was looking past me, avoiding eye contact. So are you? He said quickly. You are important to me, Estelle. I stared at him. He couldn't possibly understand the importance of those words. No one in my life had ever once told me that I was important to them. I had always felt that I was expendable, disposable. Gabe could never understand the loneliness that I had endured, so he could never know how those words broke me. I felt the tears well up, and there was nothing I could do to stop them. Confusion flashed across his face as he looked down at me. I just shook my head and pulled him down for a kiss. He cupped my face and kissed me back, running his thumb soothingly along my jaw. His touch was a balm to my soul, soothing the pain that threatened to overwhelm me at the flood of emotion. His words brought on. Gabe pulled away and looked into my eyes. Having his full attention on me was so intense that it took my breath away. He started to speak, but a knock interrupted him. He growled in frustration and released me. I pulled the blanket over myself as Gabe went to answer the door. I could hear someone speaking softly to him, but I didn't know who it was. After a few minutes, he closed the door and walked back to me. I have to go check in with the patrol, he said. Something strange happened last night during the feast. That rogue may be back. Be careful, I said. It felt like a lifetime ago that the rogue attacked me in the city. The fact that he was apparently still out there trying to get to me felt surreal. Relax today, he said. I'll come get you when I can. He kissed me quickly, then left the room. I sighed and rubbed my face. I hoped that I hadn't made him angry. Charles was important to him, and I knew that telling him about my discomfort put him in a weird position. I didn't want him to choose between us. I just felt like I needed to be honest. I decided to shower and go for a cup of coffee. I'd probably feel better if I got some fresh air today, even if it was just long enough to walk a few blocks to the cafe. I spent longer in the shower than I'd meant to. It was easy to get lost in thought under the comfort of the hot water. The tension melted away, and by the time the water started to cool, I felt much better. I wrapped a towel around myself and started to dry my hair. I thought that I heard something in the bedroom, thinking that Gabe had returned already. I poked my head out of the bathroom. I saw a box sitting on the bed. My curiosity got the best of me, and I went to investigate. It was a large cardboard box with my name scrawled messily across the front. It was addressed to a post office box, not a street address. It was unopened, so I picked at the tape until I was able to tear it off. Inside, I found a stack of my clothes and other belongings. Beneath that was a smaller box filled with the contents of the nightstand from my apartment. I didn't understand. I'd never contacted my landlord about sending my things. The only explanation was that Gabe had done it. I couldn't help but smile. I didn't know how I'd ever managed to get by without this man in my life. We'd only know each other for a few weeks, but already my whole world had shifted. Things that I once cared intensely about didn't seem to matter much anymore. Nothing else mattered much when Gabe was near me. I picked through the box, thoughtfully tossing my old, well-worn clothes into a pile. My old life seemed like a distant dream compared to my life with Gabe. Oh no, without realizing what was happening, I'd gone and fallen in love. My legs felt a little weak at the realization, and I sat on the edge of the bed. I reached into the smaller box and pulled out my necklace. The front of the locket had a delicately painted picture of a starflower. On the back, the name Estelle was engraved. I put the necklace on and held it to my heart. I was relieved to have it back. I'd started to worry that it was gone for good. This was all I had of my parents, the only clue to who I was. I kissed the hand holding the pendant and then continued to dress for the day before heading out for coffee. Gabe, I'm sorry about postponing our meeting, I said as I entered the parlor, and that I don't have much time this morning. Melody Radcliffe smiled brightly at me. It's no problem. This shouldn't take long. She assured me. Besides, the girls were so excited about the feast, they would have been bouncing off the walls anyway. Hello, Alpha, Coral, and Iris said in unison. Iris was sitting primly in one of the chairs at the table, while Coral sat on the edge of the table and kicked her leg. Hello, I said. I hear that you two have been having interesting dreams. We have, Iris said simply. So has Red. Coral chimed in. Iris hit her leg, and she rolled her eyes and dropped into a chair. I didn't know who Red was, but pups often have trouble staying on topic, so I dismissed it. What are these dreams like? A troubled look crossed Iris's face. There is fire and screaming, she said quietly. And running, Coral said. Lots of running. It's hard to tell what's happening. The moon is bright in the sky and guides the way to Red, Iris explained. Coral nodded enthusiastically. The goddess speaks to us. She says daily the star will fall to earth and expose the root of deception, she said in a sing-song voice. I frowned at the unsettling words. When the root is exposed, we can sever it. Iris finished gravely. What does that mean? I asked. Iris and Coral both shrugged. We don't know, they said together. The goddess doesn't explain things to us, Coral complained. She just shows us what needs to be seen, Iris explained. But you should be able to figure it out, she added, smile. I steepled my fingers under my chin and leaned forward in my chair. A star, that sounded like some kind of a beacon. They said that the moon goddess led the way to someone called Red. They'd mentioned that Red was having dreams too. Who's Red? I asked. Coral and Iris exchanged a look, then turned back to me. They giggled in unison. Why your mate? Chapter 22. A gift vow. I'd been out at the main checkpoint of our territory for hours already. The men had gone over every second of last night's patrol with me numerous times. No one noticed any odd scents or movements during the feast. It wasn't until morning that they discovered anything was off. We doubled the patrol since one of the guards was injured, so there shouldn't have been any gaps in security and no way for someone to sneak anywhere near our land. I couldn't make sense of what I was looking at. Blocking the trail we used to drive in and out of town was a line of newly planted saplings. It would have taken time to plant them, and it would have been loud. That wasn't the strangest part. Placed neatly beside the central tree was a large bouquet of white, 5-petaled flowers wrapped in a silver, silky material. It looked like an offering of some kind. It was starting to feel like some kind of conspiracy was unfolding. I didn't want to entertain the idea that one of our own could be behind this, but there was no way this odd activity in the forest was coming from outside of our borders, not without someone from our pack allowing strangers in Peel. I walked around the trees looking for any details that we'd missed. Why would someone want to block the road? We hardly ever used it. Gabe had gone to walk the perimeter with some of the morning patrol. He wanted to make sure there weren't any other strange gifts left last night. He was supposed to meet me back here, but it was taking longer than I'd expected. I hoped to have some insight for him by the time he got back, but I was coming up empty. I heard footsteps approaching behind me. The star will fall to earth and expose the root of deception. When the root is exposed, we can sever it. It was the third time this morning Gabe had muttered those words. I sighed and looked back at him. And there's no chance the pups are just playing a game. The Radcliffe girls like to mess with people sometimes. They found it amusing how seriously some of the adults took their dreams. No, he growled in irritation. He came to my side and looked down at the tree. I don't like this, I said softly. I didn't even want to voice what I was thinking, but I had to. Gabe, could there be a traitor? He finished for me. The cold look that came into his eyes as he said the word chilled my blood. I'd fought alongside Gabe countless times. I knew what he looked like when he was out for blood. What can we do? I asked. Find out what the hell is going on around here, he said angrily, and remind whoever is playing these games of who they're fucking with. His tone made me shudder. Where do we start? I asked. Gabe had already gone to the neighboring packs and they'd been no help at all. How could we start trying to root out a traitor among us without sending the entire pack into a panic? Gabe bent and picked up the bouquet of flowers. He turned it in his hands slowly, taking in the details of the flowers. This is some kind of a message. What kind of flowers are these? I don't know, I said with a shrug. We can ask Lucky. My mate was a botanist. She worked in the human worlds, studying unique plants for years before we met. Her knowledge and skill had proven invaluable in her role as the assistant healer for the pack. If there was some kind of message being sent with these flowers, she'd understand it. Gabe turned to one of the patrolmen. Go into the village and get Lucky Levine, he ordered. Tell her that I need her help. The young man looked startled for a moment, but hurried away when Gabe waved a hand at him impatiently. It was the wording. Gabe had said he needed help. I'm sure that seemed incredibly odd to a young member of the pack. There were two very different versions of Gabe that had solidified in the minds of the pack members. The younger members had heard the stories of the avenging angel that had decimated the remnants of the Bear Lake pack and fought off the others that had tried to take over our territory in the years after the attack. Gabe was only 13 when he'd seen his first battle, and he truly did fight like a man possessed. He'd restored our pack from a group of half-starved refugees to a formidable force that no one dared challenge. His cold, dangerous reputation was well-earned, and the stories that were told about him had made him a living legend to the pups that had grown up hearing them. Those of us that were a bit older saw Gabe differently. We remembered the teary-eyed child who had promised to protect us with his life. So we knew the sacrifices that Gabe made and how they had hardened him. He wasn't a myth, he was a man, and one that deserved to have some peace in his life. That's why the members of the pack that were so intent on rejecting Estelle were mostly young. They didn't want to see Gabe get soft. They didn't understand that she could only make him stronger. I couldn't wrap my head around Charles's behavior. If there was anyone in the pack that should recognize the need for a Luna, it was him. His treatment of Estelle infuriated me. I had to tread lightly given his reputation and position, but I wasn't sure how much longer I'd be able to hold my tongue. The twins said something else, Gabe said, once we were alone. What's that? I asked. In their dreams, they see the attack. I'm not sure if they're aware of what it is. He frowned and crossed his arms over his chest. Then the moon shows them a path. A path, I asked. To what? Gabe lifted his hand and examined the flowers again. I couldn't read the expression on his face, which was rare for me, to Estelle. The dream is pointing them to Estelle. That's what they said. He shook his head in frustration. What does it mean? Gabe rubbed the back of his neck and stared at the trees. I'll have to meet with Edwina. I grimaced. Old Edwina made no secret of her hatred for Gabe. If he was willing to see her, then he truly believed this was a dire situation. My heart sank. Eventually she'll need to meet Estelle anyway, I said. I don't have to like it. He grumbled. He perked up and turned toward the path behind us. I smiled as the scent of rosewood and lemongrass reached me. That was fast, I said. It's not often Gabe calls for me. Lucky said. She came around a curve in the path and walked toward us. Estelle was at her side, which surprised me. They seemed to be becoming fast friends. I caught the look of surprise and excitement that flitted across Gabe's face at the sight of Estelle. He started to raise his hand toward her, but judging by the way he dropped it to his side immediately, it was a subconscious movement. Estelle was far less reserved. She walked directly to Gabe and brushed her fingers against his in a subtle but intimate greeting. I couldn't help but smile at them. I remembered how hard it was to keep my hands off of Lucky when we'd first met. I felt bad that Gabe was forced to be so reserved with her whenever they were out together. What's going on, Estelle asked? Was someone else hurt? The look of concern on her face was obvious. No, I said quickly. I can see why she'd think that we had sent for a healer. We needed a botanist, actually. Oh, Lucky looked excited, and I couldn't help but smile. How can I help? Gabe held the bouquet of flowers out toward her. What are these, and why would someone have left them here? Lucky took the bouquet and looked it over closely. Her face was pinched in concentration as she turned it over at her hand. They're balloon flowers, he said. These look fresh. They aren't native around here, but they can be invasive. It wouldn't really surprise me if there were some growing nearby. What do they mean, darling? I asked softly. She glanced at me and smiled apologetically. It depends. They mean different things to different cultures, but usually when given as a gift, they're a sign of friendship, love, and honesty. What about these saplings? I asked, pointing to the little row of trees in the road. Silver birch trees, she said. The leaves, bark, and branches are used in various medicines. Sometimes they're considered a symbol of protection, too. Lucky handed the bouquet to Estelle, then stepped toward the trees to take a closer look. What the hell does this mean? Gabe asked. Who breaks in and leaves a gift? Lucky knelt in front of the saplings and placed her palm on the earth around the roots. It's soft. They were definitely planted recently. She sat on her heels and looked at Gabe thoughtfully. Forgive me if I'm out of line for suggesting it, but could these be for Estelle? Gabe tensed visibly and put his arm around Estelle's waist. She looked down at the flowers in her hand, curiously. Why would they be for her? Gabe demanded. Doesn't it seem like a welcome gift? Lucky said. She stood and gestured to the trees, then the flowers, protection, love, and friendship. Why not just give them to me, then, Estelle asked. It was certainly an odd method of delivery, leaving them on the road into town. Maybe they couldn't, Lucky suggested. It's possible that whoever left them wouldn't be welcome in the village. Stella. Gabe was clearly upset by this strange gift that was left in the forest. He had his arm around my waist as we walked home. I leaned into his side, hoping that having me close would help him relax. I was just as confused as anyone about the situation. Lucky had suggested moving the trees out of the path, so Val had stayed behind to help her transplant them. She hadn't wanted to get rid of them because they'd be useful medically once they'd matured. I was holding the flowers in my arm, and Gabe kept glancing at them with a sour look on his face. They're pretty, I said the next time I caught him looking. You like flowers, he asked. I don't know, many people that don't. I held them up toward him. They're wrapped so nicely. Even if they weren't meant for me, they're clearly a gift. I don't trust it, Gabe said. He tightened his arm around me. You're just being protective, I said softly, which I appreciate. He looked at me and a smile played at his lips. I was learning to see through his mask, but he was also starting to drop his guard just a little. It made me feel special. I looked back at the street in time to see Estelle glaring at me from the end of the block. I returned her stare steadily. Her nose was still bandaged, and I took satisfaction in the fact that I may have left a permanent mark. Charles stepped out of a building and stood beside her. He shot me a look, then turned to Isolde and ushered her inside. A chill passed over me as they went. They were up to something. And I was scared to find out what. Chapter 23, The First Shift. Estelle. It had been a few days since the flowers had been discovered in the forest, and things had been quiet, but tense, since then. Charles and Isolde had been absent from the main house, which was strange to everyone that I'd mentioned it to. There had been no more odd occurrences around the border or incidents in the village. Everything was quiet. In the calm, Gabe hadn't had much to do. Because of that, we'd been spending a lot more time together. My wolf was thrilled at the attention. I'd never felt that part of me so content. It was weird, but in a good way. Gabe had gotten more comfortable touching me without checking to see if we were being watched. I was learning what it took to make him smile, and I loved that it was something I could do. I felt like I was getting my first taste of normality since I'd come to the village. It was nice seeing that Gabe's life didn't always have to be tense meetings and arguments. He liked to read, which explained the size of the library in the house. I'd found him engrossed in books numerous times over the past few days. More than once, I'd caught myself leaning against the doorframe and just watching him. Seeing his handsome face relaxed was almost as good as seeing him smile. Life was pretty great, but I knew it couldn't last. There were too many issues unresolved for this peace to be anything but a brief reprieve. Everyone in the village was busily preparing for the full moon tonight. Gabe had mentioned that there was a celebration coming up a few times, but whatever preparation was going on evidently didn't require much from him. This morning, he had gone to town to finalize things. I decided to kill some time in the library. I'd noticed that there were a lot of books on genealogy and family records, and I couldn't help but be curious. I knew that even if my family was included somewhere in these books, I wouldn't recognize them, but it didn't stop me from looking. The sheer scope of the records was impressive. They had family trees that went back centuries. You look serious, Gabe said. I looked up from the book I'd been flipping through and smiled at him. I shook my head. I was just waiting for you to get back. She sat beside me and looked at the book in my lap. She frowned at it. You're looking at old family tree. I was just curious, I said softly. Gabe must have seen that I was uncomfortable because he dropped the topic. I'd like you to come with me tonight, he said. Where are you going? I set the book aside and gave him my full attention. It is the last full moon of summer, he said. We typically celebrate by shifting into our wolf forms and going for a run. Most of the pack participates, and it would be a chance to show your solidarity with us. So you want me to come out with you and shift? I asked. I could hear the nerves in my own voice. Yes, he said simply. Why I clasped my hands in my lap. I wasn't sure why the idea made me feel uneasy. A few reasons. Firstly, you need to get more in touch with your wolf. It's not good to keep her leashed so much. She's a part of you. I couldn't argue with that now that I knew my wolf was there. I did want to find ways to understand that part of me better. And the second reason I asked? I want to see you, he said. I blushed a little at the meaningful look he was giving me.
I thought so, I said teasingly.
Is that a problem? He asked. No, I've been curious about your wolf form too, I confessed. He smiled at me, and I felt myself starting to blush. I'm just nervous. Why he sounded genuinely curious. For some reason, that just made me feel more self-conscious. I don't know what my wolf form looks like. What if there's something weird about me? I tried to make it sound like a joke, but failed miserably. I had transformed in the past, but not intentionally. What if I couldn't do it on command? I'd look like a fool and embarrass Gabe in front of everyone. It would just be one more disaster that proved I didn't belong here. So what if there is, Gabe asked. His tone was completely dismissive, and it irritated me. That's not comforting, I whispered. He looked at me for a moment before speaking again. You can transform with me in private first if it will make you feel better. He offered. That's a great idea, I said brightly. The thought of transforming in front of the pack made me nervous. But if I could be alone with Gabe for the change, I would feel much better. At least he wouldn't laugh at me if I couldn't figure it out right away. He looked surprised that I'd agreed so quickly. He stood and held his hand out to me. No one else will be out now, he said. I took his hand and he pulled me to my feet. Gabe. Estelle looked nervous as we entered the clearing. In a few hours, the entire pack would be gathering here to shift. For now, it was just the two of us. Considering we were alone, I didn't understand her nerve. Still, I was glad that she'd agreed to come with me. I wanted to be the first to see my mate's full wolf form. Ever since Val reported to me after the craft fair, I'd wanted to see it with my own eyes. A red wolf? Red as a flame. He'd said I'd never seen anything like it. I looked at Estella's strawberry blonde hair. Surely she couldn't be red like that, could she? She looked around the clearing and rubbed her arms absently. I couldn't help but find her endearing right now. Despite her discomfort, she was so eager to share this with me. You've transformed before, I said. Not on purpose, she said shyly. I don't really know how it works. What does it feel like? She asked softly. I've only done it by mistake. The first time it happened, what were you thinking about? I asked. I had just turned 18. I was finally going to be out on my own. I was excited to have the freedom to go where I wanted, she said softly. So I was out past curfew, walking in the small wooded area near the group home. I hadn't moved out yet, she explained. So you were feeling secure and uninhibited,
I said.
I couldn't help but smile. In the weeks that Estelle had spent with me, she'd been anxious and afraid a majority of the time. She had plenty of reasons to be. The relief of finding my mate blinded me in the beginning to the confusion and fear that she had experienced. It took Val ripping into me the way only he can to make me see how careless I was being with her. It wasn't as though I'd coddled her since then. I'd simply made the effort to understand her reaction. Estelle had been more comfortable in recent days, and while it was certainly due in part to the calm in the village, I like to think that I was being a better mate to her. I guess so, she said. Do you feel secure now? She smiled at me and nodded. Just remember that you're in control. Your wolf is part of you. Focus on her and don't resist the feeling when it starts. It'll come naturally, I said. Estelle looked at me uncertainly for a moment, then sighed. She shook out her arms to release the nervous tension she was carrying. After a few minutes, it was clear she still wasn't able to relax. Would you like me to go first? I asked. She nodded enthusiastically, and I laughed. I could see her cheeks turn pink as I started to remove my clothes. It was hardly the first time she watched me undress. Her reaction made me smile. I folded my clothes and sat them aside. I guess I didn't think about what would happen to our clothes, she said. Now, I'm really happy that we're doing this in private. I shook my head a little. You get used to it. I closed my eyes and let the shift wash over me when the familiar sensation passed. I looked at her. The wonder in her eyes was captivating. I approached her and sat in front of her. She reached for me but hesitated. I nudged her hand and she ran her fingers down my back. Wow, she breathed. Okay, I can do this, she said softly. She slipped her dress off and left her clothes beside mine. Then she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. I could see her shoulders relax after a few steady breaths. I watched her shift with fascination. She was smaller than many of the wolves in the pack, but not the smallest. She was sleek with long limbs and her coat was incredible. The bright red, orange was muted by streaks of black, but it was more stunning because of the contrast. I'd never seen another shifter like her. You're beautiful, I told her. She tilted her head in confusion. I probably should have prepared her for how different speaking would feel in this form. I hadn't actually prepared her at all. I was too eager to share this with her. You've never told me that before, she said, and she was right. I did find her beautiful. I just hadn't felt that it was necessary to tell her. Surely she already knew. Estelle nudged me playfully and drew my attention back to her. It was clear that she was excited. She nudged me again, then ran. It was silly, and part of me wanted to scoff at her. Instead, I ran after her. She was agile and dodged me by zipping around trees. I was surprised that it actually took some effort to catch her. When I did, I pounced and pinned her beneath me. I could hear her breathless laughter in my head, and it made my heart swell. Seeing her so happy and comfortable in her wolf form made me proud. Despite her upbringing, she was embracing her wolf. She wiggled away from me and ran again. I laughed and followed after her. I couldn't remember the last time I'd played. It was strangely liberating. Soon, the forest was alive with activity. Estelle paused in her play to watch the others run. I could sense her awe at the sight, and it filled me with pride. Seeing my pack, playful and free, was all I had ever wanted, and sharing this moment with my mate was almost overwhelming. Lucky trotted over to Estelle and lowered her head. Instinctively, Estelle knew what she was signaling. She let out an excited yelp and pounced at Lucky. The two ran off, tumbling and playing happily. Estelle was all wolf, no doubt could remain after seeing her like this. I could sense others in the pack watching them. In their play, Estelle bumped into a female with a light brown coat. It was Anna, one of the women who instigated the craft fair incident. I watched the interaction closely, ready to intervene. Estelle lowered her head and indicated her desire to play. Everything was still for a moment as Anna stared at her suspiciously. Then Anna yelped and nudged her. The two ran off with Lucky and continued their game. I howled my joy and Estelle followed suit. The sound reverberated around us and a cacophony of howls was returned from the pack. It was time for the festivities to begin. Chapter 24. Estelle. I was running through a cold river. My paws were numb, but I kept moving. Time was running out. I could feel that he was right behind me. If I didn't find a safe place soon, it would be too late. The smell of burning wood made it impossible to track his scent. There was no way to know if I'd lost him without stopping and checking behind me. I couldn't risk it. I had to press on. My lungs were burning from the effort. I must have been running for miles by now. My mind was disorganized. I couldn't focus on anything but the need to find safety. I jumped out of the river and kept running. My paws hit concrete, and I hesitated. If I went into the city, it would be harder for him to find me, but I would have no help. I heard something crashing through the foliage behind me, and I ran. Suddenly, I was jolted from my slumber. I sat up quickly and blinked my eyes. There was sunlight streaming through the window, and it disoriented me. I had just been running. No, that was a dream. I was in bed and Gabe was lying beside me. My heart was thundering in my chest, and I felt breathless. I placed my palm to my forehead and shut my eyes. I took a deep breath through my mouth and slowly released it from my nose. That was a bizarre dream. The fear had felt so real. The details were starting to fade, but I was sure I'd had the dream before. It took me a few minutes to remember when it was at the motel in town, before I'd gone to the airport. Why would I be dreaming about this again? It felt so strangely real. It couldn't just be a dream. I rubbed my cold hands as I thought about it. "What's wrong?" Gabe asked. He sat up and put his arm around me. "I just had the weirdest dream," I said softly. My heart still wasn't calm. He must have been able to feel its erratic beating in my pulse. "Dream? I know it's silly." "No, that's not it." Gabe looked thoughtful. "The twins told me that you were having dreams of the past." "That's right." I thought about the first day I'd met Iris and Coral. They had asked me if the dreams had started. They told me that the dreams were memories from someone close to me. "That doesn't make sense," I said. Gabe looked concerned. "What happened in the dream?" "I was in my wolf form and I was running from something," I explained. "I don't know what it was. I ran through a river and all the way to a paved road. There was something that I had to protect, but I don't know." "Are you sure it was you?" I stared at him in confusion now that he asked. I wasn't sure. I shook my head slowly. "I don't know." Gabe squeezed me gently. He was deep in thought, but he didn't say anything more. I leaned into his side and sighed. After a few minutes, he released me and got out of bed. "I think that it's becoming obvious that your family history is related to whatever is going on," he said. I hated it, but I agreed. "There's no other reason I can think of that someone would want me dead or be leaving odd gifts," I said. "I know you don't want to talk about it," he pressed, "but we need to try to find out who your parents were." Gabe was pacing in front of the window anxiously. He was worried that I was going to get upset. I nodded. "You're right." He stopped walking and looked at me. "You're all right with that?" "I think that it's the best course of action," I said. I wasn't all right with it. I was worried about what we might learn. Gabe was quiet for a long moment. He walked back to the bed and sat beside me again. "It's your life," he replied graciously. "You should be the one to find out." "How?" "We have resources that we can start digging into." He said, "I can have Val help you if you want. I wouldn't trust anyone else to be involved." I nodded. I hated to ask more of Val, but there's no one else I would be comfortable with. "Okay." Gabe reached for my hand and I squeezed his gratefully. It surprised me how comfortable he'd gotten with comforting me. So I never would have predicted in the first weeks of our relationship that this softer side of him would emerge. He always seemed uncomfortable in these moments, but they meant a lot to me, and I think he knew that. "Thank you," I said softly. Gabe just hummed in response. "I have some work to do today. I'll send Val to see you when we wrap up our other obligations." He kissed the back of my hand, then stood and walked to the dresser, where he started to get dressed. "Sure," I said half-heartedly. I rubbed my eyes and got to my feet. I would find something to do to keep myself busy for the day. I needed to clear my head after that dream. Whose memory could it have been, and what were they trying to protect? I couldn't imagine what would have caused fear like that. "Are you going to be all right alone?" Gabe asked. I forced a smile and nodded at him, but his face told me he wasn't convinced. He let it go, though. He kissed me, then left the room. I took my time getting dressed, then made my way outside. The house was quiet this early in the morning, and it was nice not to come downstairs to people wandering the hallways in the hopes of talking to Gabe. It astounded me how busy he was. Surely he could delegate some of these responsibilities. How was he supposed to do anything but work? I went outside and meandered for a while. I considered getting something to eat, but I didn't feel like talking to anyone. I felt lethargic and ended up stopping at the garden behind the inn to rest. The morning was chilly and the leaves in the trees were starting to change color. I looked at the plants and disassociated for a while. Had my life gotten so complicated, murder plots, psychic dreams, and shape-shifting were not things that I was prepared for when I'd ventured out on my own. Part of me wished that I could walk away from the fear and uncertainty of all of this. It was a small part, though. I wouldn't walk away from Gabe for anything. Thought about the look of concern on his face and the way he'd held my hand this morning. It was obvious that he cared for me, even if he was still figuring out how to show it. I probably wasn't the easiest partner in the world either. So much of Gabe's time had been spent defending me and trying to clean up my messes. I owed it to him to learn more about the rules and etiquette of life in the pack. I wanted to be a support in his life, not another source of stress. The sun was high in the sky before I finally left the garden. I got a bite to eat at the cafe and was grateful to find that I could relax there now. No one pointed at me or whispered about me. A few people did wave or tell me good morning, though. Gabe was right. Participating in the full moon celebration had gone a long way to help the pack accept me, even if I was, apparently, odd-looking in my wolf form. Hey, Estelle, the woman behind the counter, called out to me. It was Anna again from the craft fair. I was wary of her, but it seemed like even she was coming to accept me. She smiled as I leaned out of my chair to see her clearly. Yeah. Gabe is sending for you, she said. She waved a little note toward me. I didn't see who had brought it in, which just went to show how lost in thought I'd been. I walked to the counter and took the note. Thanks, Anna. No problem, she said. I opened the note and read the hastily scrawled message. Val was waiting for me in the library. I looked at the clock and was shocked to see how late it was. I'd spent the entire day just aimlessly wandering the village. I rushed back to the house and into the library. Val was sitting in one of the comfortable chairs near the window and stood to greet me when I entered. I'm sorry to keep you waiting, I said. I haven't been here long, he said dismissively. The smile fell from his face and he looked me over seriously. Gabe said that you're interested in learning about your family, he said carefully. I appreciated that he recognized it was a sensitive topic. If I was really going to do this, I'd have to get used to talking about it, though. Yes, I said, something strange is going on, and I feel like my past may be the key to figuring it out. I agree, he said. That's why I've already started looking into it. I hope that you aren't offended. I'm surprised, I said. I wasn't offended. I should have expected, given all of the drama around my past, that Gabe would have done a bit of poking around. I was a little upset that he hadn't told me about it. I haven't learned much, Val said, but I think if we work on this together, we can get to the bottom of things. That's a scary prospect, I muttered. I wanted to know, but it felt like there was a dark cloud hanging over me, and I didn't know what might be revealed when it cleared. I'm sure that it is, he said sympathetically. It was easier to have this conversation with Val than it would have been with Gabe. Val was better at showing his concern and making it clear that he understood the emotions at play for me. He made the effort to be sensitive. I wasn't sure that Gabe and I could tackle this together without arguing. But I want to know, where do we start? I asked. Well, you have an unusual coat in your wolf form. I've never seen a red wolf. That's helpful, I asked. It must be genetic, he explained. If that's the case, there may be a note about it in our record. The tricky part is that many of our records are incomplete. A lot of documentation was lost during the attack. I know that we might not find anything. I said, we really have nothing to go on. I swallowed the emotions that were threatening to choke me. I have to try. Val nodded sagely. All right, we'll start in the morning. Try to get some rest tonight. You look exhausted. I was exhausted. I hadn't slept well, and the emotions of the day had zapped my energy. Thank you, Val, I said. You're a good friend. You smiled at me. I'm glad you feel that way. I smiled back weakly, then headed to the door, intending to go up and get ready for bed. My already bad mood soured further as I opened the door to find Isolde standing in the hallway. I glared openly at her, and she returned the expression. I couldn't be bothered to deal with her today. I walked by her without a word and went upstairs. Chapter 25, The Avenging Angel. Estelle. Gabe had finally been able to arrange a council meeting with the leaders of the other packs in the area. He'd been trying for weeks to get everyone to take the rogue activity seriously. It wasn't until another territory's borders were breached that they seemed willing to listen. Gabe was irritated that his word hadn't been sufficient, and I didn't blame him. I had a feeling that things with the other packs were more complicated than I knew. I was warned to steer clear of the parlor where the meeting would take place. Gabe had told me to ignore any shouting I heard. It seemed like diplomatic relations were more than a little tense. Val and I were in the library flipping through family records in search of any mention of red or orange fur. It was tedious at best, and we'd already gone through 2 pots of coffee today. It was only day 2 of our search for answers about my family. I was trying not to get my hopes up, but it was hard. The possibility that these dusty old books could tell me anything about my past was too enticing. I knew nothing about where I'd come from. All I had was my locket. And for all I knew, that was just a trinket accidentally dropped with me. There are so many families in these records, I commented as I grabbed another book from the stack beside me. Are these just packs in this area? Mostly, Val confirmed. We have a little information about packs in surrounding regions, but that information is much less detailed. I can't believe there are this many shifters just in Minnesota. Val laughed. It just feels like a lot because you've been staring at these lists of names all day, he said. Can you tell me about some of the other packs? I asked. I was curious about the men that were meeting with Gabe, and it was distracting me. It was far too easy to get distracted doing repetitive work like this. Sure, Val said he closed the book that he'd been looking at and set it aside. There are 4 packs in the region, including ours. We're known as the Eagle's Nest Pack. There's also the Lost Lake Pack, the Crystal Waters Pack, and the Ash Forest Pack. The Crystal Waters Pack is one of the oldest in the region. They're highly respected, and the other packs tend to look to them for guidance. Lucky is originally from there. She left to study in the city, which is frowned upon by a lot of people, especially the elders. It makes it difficult for her to visit home. A sad expression flitted over his face, but only for a moment before he shrugged it off and continued. Lost Lake is reserved. They prefer to avoid social situations with the other packs and very rarely venture out. The fact that their alpha is here today is noteworthy. The Ash Forest Pack is aggressive. We've had conflicts with them plenty of times in the past. The alpha only agrees to meet with us at all because he respects Gabe as a warrior. In the past, we'd meet with the other packs regularly, but after the attack, things changed. Now, I hate to say it, but Gabe's reputation is part of the problem. Reputation, I asked. I'd seen the deference and fear that some people showed when Gabe was around, but I didn't understand it. He could be cold and he was frightening when he was angry, but I had a feeling there was more to it than that. Val sighed and glanced out the window. It was about 18 years ago, he said softly. Back then, there was another pack. The Bear Lake Bat. I've heard of them. Gabe told me a little bit about what happened. They were close allies, and one day they just attacked without warning or reason. I said. Val nodded and looked back at me. He was having trouble holding eye contact, which was unusual for him. This topic was making him uncomfortable. We never found out what their reason was. He said it was the middle of the night when the attack happened. I was 11 at the time. I'd fought to protect my family. We were among the lucky ones. So many people died on both sides. Our packs were left in tatters. The emotion in his voice was clear. I felt bad for bringing up painful memories, but I wanted to understand what had happened. It was obvious that this event had shaped Gabe into the man he was. I waited for Val to keep going. In the aftermath, the rest of the packs refused to help any of us. I don't know exactly why. Gabe and I are both too young to have understood much of what happened in those first fist years afterward. The pack was weakened and left with only a young child as our leader. Some people abandoned the pack and went rogue. You can imagine the impact that had on morale. What was left of the pack clung together, he said with a sardonic smile. I couldn't help but wonder if the abandonment was a factor in Gabe's anger when I'd tried to leave. I felt incredibly guilty and had to look away from Val. We made what repairs we could to our homes and focused on just staying alive. Over the next few years, we lost more and more territory to other packs. We were too weak to defend ourselves. The risk of losing a fight was too great, so we didn't try to resist. The elders didn't think it was worth it. A dark look crossed his features, but it passed quickly. I'd never seen Val look angry before. It was frightening. It got harder and harder to feed everyone. Eventually, more people left. A decade passed like that with us barely holding on. Charles seemed content to keep scraping by, but Gabe wasn't. He was still just a kid, but he was a damn stubborn one. When a group of rogues came into our territory, Gabe fought back. He was incredibly brutal in battle. It was as though he'd been holding on to all of his anger and resentment for the past 10 years and waiting for the chance to unleash it on someone. He protected us. He looked down at his hands and shook his head as if he needed to shake the images from his mind. Myself and some of the other guys started training with him after that. We were a small force, but an effective one. Over the course of the next 5 years, we were able to reclaim all of the territory that had once belonged to us. Gabe had met with the alphas of each of the other packs and made it clear that we would not be bullied any longer. Some of those meetings resulted in fights. Gabe earned a nickname after he thoroughly beat the most formidable of the alphas from the Ash Forest pack in one-on-one battle. They called him the Avenging Angel. Because of the Angel Gabriel? I asked. Exactly. He said, the other packs are wary of us. I've never been able to figure out why they haven't exactly been forthright about it. So the welcome gift probably wouldn't be from any of them, I asked, not knowing where those flowers came from. Drove Gabe crazy. I think it made him a little jealous too. It's possible, but I don't think so. He said, I really can't wrap my head around where that might have come from. Lucky is sure that it was meant as a gift. Is it possible? Whoa. I hesitated. I'd been turning a thought over in my head ever since the flowers were handed to me, but I was afraid to voice it. It seemed far-fetched at best. Is what possible? Al asked. He had a carefully neutral expression on his face. Do you have a theory? Is it possible that they were left by someone who knows who I am, a relative or something? I had to look away from Val again. It's probably just wishful thinking on my part. There was no reason to believe that I came from one of the packs in this territory. I was surrendered to a hospital in Wisconsin. It wasn't really that far from here. That was enough to make me hopeful. I don't know. Val said carefully, it wouldn't be the craziest thing I've seen, but I think it's unlikely. Right? I know. Just saw I waved my hand dismissively. Never mind. It was a stupid suggestion. Val stood and walked across the room. He sat beside me on the couch and put his arm around my shoulder. I know this is hard, he said softly. We might find answers and we might not. I don't want to tell you not to get your hopes up, but try not to put your whole heart into finding something that might not exist. I leaned my head against his shoulder. Thanks, I said softly. You're like the big brother I always wanted, I said jokingly. Oh no, I'd need to be way meaner to you for that. Val laughed. I laughed too. He patted my shoulder and stood. I think we both need a break, he said. I nodded my agreement. We'd been at this all morning and hadn't eaten lunch. The conversation had gotten incredibly emotional, and I could tell that Val wanted a few minutes to himself to recover. It had never occurred to me until today that Val had been present at the attack too. Being older, he would have far more vivid memories of it. The fact that he was willing to talk about it surprised me. I can go get us some food from Russ's? I offered. That would be great. Val sat back down in his chair and picked up the book he'd been looking through when I interrupted him. I'll be back soon, I said. Val waved and flipped the book open. I could hear voices the moment I opened the library door, but I did my best to ignore them. Gabe said not to pay attention to the noise from the council meeting. Still, the sound of shouting was unmistakable. I hoped that Gabe wouldn't be too angry when this was all said and done, but I had a feeling he would be. The fresh air was cool and helped me to clear my head. What I had just learned about Gabe was a lot to process. It was so much pressure for someone so young. I couldn't even imagine being barely a teenager and trying to take over the leadership of an entire community. To take over and immediately be thrown into battle was incomprehensible to me. I could only imagine how intense the fighting must have been. Val's expression made it clear that the memories were unpleasant for him. I thought of the streak of white in Gabe's dark hair. The stress that it would take to cause that in someone so young was hard to comprehend. The stony mask he wore most of the time hid his thoughts and emotions, and I could see why that would be useful for him in light of what he was dealing with. Gabe really had been dealt an unfair hand. He was an incredible man for surviving the things he'd been through. That didn't mean that he should be forced to keep enduring such hardship, and I was determined to do everything that I could to ease his burden. Chapter 26, Protecting Gabe. I woke with Gabe's arms around me. It was rapidly becoming my favorite way to wake up. I nuzzled close to his chest and smiled. Val and I had nearly made it through all of the family registries and still had no luck finding any reference to a red wolf. It was disheartening. I was starting to feel like I was wasting everyone's time. Val had remained optimistic, but I was pretty sure he was just being nice. I owed Lucky a fruit arrangement or something. She'd lost so much time with Val because of me. When I'd finally gone to bed last night, I could hear Gabe's meeting still going in full swing. I had tried to stay awake and wait for him, but I must have fallen asleep. Gabe's arms tightened around me, and he shifted slightly. It's early, he said without opening his eyes. I wondered what time he'd finally been able to come to bed. Sorry, I whispered. I wasn't trying to wake you. How was the meeting? Frustrating, he grumbled. It's impossible to get anywhere with those intransigent old men. They still aren't taking the situation seriously. It seemed ridiculous to me that they wouldn't take action just to make sure the rogue problem didn't spread. Not seriously enough, he said. He rolled us over and pinned me to the bed, and I squealed in surprise, and they cost me a night with my mate, he said. I wrapped my arms around his neck and pulled him into a kiss. I missed you when I came to bed, I confessed. The corner of his mouth twitched up into a smirk before he kissed me again. He nuzzled my neck and ran his hand up my side. I hate leaving you to sleep alone, he said. I tilted my head back and sighed. Where did you go yesterday? He asked. I knew that he hated being away from me. He was possessive and protective, and if he couldn't account for my movements, he got agitated. To get food, I answered. It would have driven me crazy to be watched so closely by anyone but him. I couldn't explain why, but when Gabe acted this way toward me, it felt justified. We have a kitchen. He growled. He pulled my shirt over my head and dropped it aside.
Yeah.
You shouldn't be walking around on your own when there are strangers in the village. Why not? I asked with a scoff. What could possibly happen if I walk a few blocks by myself? Gabe pinned my hands and stared down at me intensely. He didn't like when I talked back, but that only made me want to do it more. Just because I wanted to be with him didn't mean I was going to be an obedient little pet. The same thing that happened when you went to a restaurant alone, he said coldly. I bit my lip and looked away. That was a fair point. Don't argue with me. Saying that really makes me want to argue. I muttered. How are you so hard-headed and so skittish at the same time? He asked. The annoyance was clear in his tone. I'm not skittish, I said softly. I pulled at my arms weakly and arched my back. I'm not trying to run from you. His eyes darkened and he nipped my shoulder. You couldn't run fast enough, he rumbled against my throat. I shuddered as his teeth pressed into my skin. He could hurt me easily, but he wouldn't. I trusted him not to. For some reason, that made the sharp contact incredibly arousing. Yeah, I outran you just fine when... He grabbed my hips and flipped me onto my stomach. I caught you easily. He growled. I could hear him moving and tried to look over my shoulder. He was taking his clothes off and smirked when he caught me looking. I turned away from him and hid my face in the pillow as I blushed. It was hardly the first time I'd seen him nude, but it made my heart beat erratically every time. The way I yearned for him was embarrassing, but I loved it. He grabbed my hips and pulled me up onto my hands and knees. I enjoy chasing you, he said. He grabbed the elastic of my panties and yanked them down, making me gasp. I could feel my face turning red, but the chase is only half the fun. I bit my lip to stifle a moan as his deep voice rumbled over me. He gripped my hips tightly and pulled me backward. I spread my legs and braced my arms under me. The anticipation alone was enough to make my breathing speed up. You're so defiant, he said, as he pressed into me until I have you alone. Then you're such a good girl for me. I moaned and twisted my hands in the bedsheet. His words filled me with a heady combination of lust and shame. I wanted to hide my face, but I also wanted to beg him to keep talking. He moaned as I pressed back against him. His voice was going to be the end of me. He didn't waste time once he was inside of me. He started to move, snapping his hips in a slow, powerful rhythm. I held onto the mattress and whined. It felt like the only thing that I could do. Each movement sent a bolt of pleasure that made me shake, but his rhythm was frustratingly slow. After a few minutes, it was clear that this wouldn't be enough to satisfy me. Gabe, I whined his movement. Halted as soon as his name left my lips. I lost my confidence the moment he stopped moving. I opened my mouth, but felt too embarrassed to speak. Tell me what you want, Estelle, he commanded. He bent over me so that he could nip my ear. I shuddered and gasped. Speak up, he whispered. Move faster. I blurted out, please. Good girl. He said, He bit my shoulder lightly, then straightened up. He gripped my hips and slammed into me. I cried out as he pulled out and slammed back before setting a vigorous rhythm. A mortifying string of moans and whines were falling out of my mouth, and I couldn't keep my voice down. The jolts of pleasure were coming back to back now, feeling more like a continuous current. My arms started to shake, and I felt unsteady. I arched my back and cried out as the pleasure started to overwhelm me. Gabe moaned, and the sound was enough to tip me over the edge. My body was shaking so hard that I was afraid I might fall. I almost buried my face in the pillow, but I wanted to see Gabe. He hadn't finished yet. I looked over my shoulder at him. The angle was awkward, but once I locked eyes with him, I couldn't move. I was transfixed by the sight of him. His hair was disheveled and pushed back from his forehead, and his chest was heaving from the effort of keeping such a rapid pace. His eyes were bright, flashing silver as he stared at me. His lips were parted, and I could see that his teeth were sharp, his fangs elongated. I'd never seen Gabe look so unrestrained. The sight sent a shudder through me, and I felt my muscles tense. Gabe growled and threw his head back in pleasure. The sight and the sensation of his touch sent me over the precipice. I cried out and trembled as the sensations crashed through me. Gabe released me and I collapsed onto the bed. I was panting like I'd just run a marathon. I threw my arm over my eyes and tried to focus on my breathing. I felt Gabe get out of the bed, and a moment later, there was a damp cloth being pressed into my hand. I opened my eyes with some effort and saw him setting a glass of water on the nightstand. I sat up and drank the water gratefully. Gabe chuckled at me, but I ignored it. I was far too dazed to come up with a snappy retort. I lazily cleaned myself up and sat on the edge of the bed. I watched Gabe as he dressed. I felt like I just couldn't catch my breath, and my legs were like rubber. Gabe looked at me and smirked before pulling his shirt over his head. Don't be so satisfied with yourself, I said as I failed to hide my blush. Voila, he asked with a grin. You're... I gaped at him, unable to come up with a comeback. He looked amused and walked to the door. I'll see you tonight. Don't wander off alone. I shook my head. I felt like he was being overprotective, but his instincts had proved correct so far. I showered and got dressed. I needed to get down to the library to help Val dig through the last of the family record. Knowing Val, he was probably already hard at work. I didn't want to keep him waiting too long. I hurried downstairs, but I paused halfway down the staircase. I could hear voices near the landing below. It took me a moment to recognize them. Charles and Isaid were speaking softly to one another. I was immediately annoyed that they were here. I had enjoyed my break from them. If they were going to start hanging around again, it was going to be hard to ignore them. I contemplated going back upstairs and trying to wait them out. I really didn't want to deal with either of them before I could come to a decision. I heard Isolde's voice. I don't understand why no one is listening to me, she complained. I've tried talking to Anna, and even she has changed her mind. She actually thinks that Estelle is good for Gabe. She's bewitched them just as she has our alpha, Charles responded coldly. He thought that I was somehow tricking everyone into liking me. I shook my head in disbelief. What will it take for him to see the truth? Isolde asked sadly. She's making him look pathetic. It's shameful the way he fawns over her, as if there's something so special about her. An alpha like Gabe can't be seen with such a weak crybaby of a mate. If I was such a weak crybaby, why was her nose broken? I wanted to scream or hit her again. When was she going to back off? I could perfectly picture the hateful glare on her face as she spoke. I thought for sure we'd be rid of her when the pack was convinced she wanted Gabe to leave. I told everyone. I knew it. She was the one spreading rumors about me, but hearing it with my own ears still wasn't proof it would be my word against hers. This was so infuriating. He's blinded by her affection, Charles spat. His voice was dripping with disgust. He doesn't know any better than to fall for her wiles. We'll find a way to get through to him, he said confidently. I could hear footsteps as they started to move down the hall. It may hurt him at first, but it's for the best. I growled. There was something wrong with Charles. How could someone who claimed to care about Gabe talk about him like that? I had to figure out what was going on with them before they could do any more damage. They thought that I was weak, but they were wrong. There was nothing I wouldn't do to protect Gabe. Chapter 27, Loss of an Elsa. Estelle. Val and I had taken a break to eat lunch. We were sitting across from each other in 2 plush chairs in the library and eating sandwiches. Lucky had been kind enough to bring us. It was a nice break. The morning had been unfruitful. Again, we only had a few books left to check. I was determined to get through the rest of the records today, but I was distracted. I felt terrible about it. Val looked exhausted, but he was still here helping me out. I owed it to him to put my best foot forward. But I couldn't stop thinking about the conversation I'd overheard between Isolde and Charles. I was furious about the way they talked about Gabe. Charles was a two-faced liar, that was clear. But why? What was motivating him to act this way? It couldn't just be that he wanted his daughter to be the Luna. That was far too simple an explanation. The way he looked at me was so cold and full of loathing. It had to be more than misplaced jealousy. I just couldn't make sense of it. I didn't know him well enough to guess what might be behind this conspiracy to break Gabe and me up. It seemed so personal to him. It made no sense. I pushed my plate aside and turned to Val, so I began awkwardly. Charles is a beta too, right? Val looked up from his coffee cup and frowned. He was the beta to Gabe's father? Yes. Why? He looked so confused by the sudden question. I threw my hands up. What is his deal? I asked. Like, why is he such a jerk? Val shook his head at me and laughed. Did he do something else? He asked. I frowned. He'd believe me if I told him what I overheard, but what would that accomplish? What could Val do about it? I didn't want to tell Gabe yet. I just didn't know enough to prove anything. I just want to understand why he has such a problem with me. I said. The mirth vanished from Val's face and he sighed. I didn't hear what he said at the feast. He said, but Lucky told me about it. It was a cruel thing to do. It was, I said. I considered telling him everything, how Charles had looked at me like I was beneath him, how he'd tracked me down to the motel and paid me to leave, and how he and Isolde were plotting something. I trusted Val, but there was a small voice in the back of my mind telling me that he wouldn't believe me. I couldn't take the chance. Charles was the beta, and when the alpha, Gabe's father, died, Charles became the de facto leader. When Gabe was older, he ruled with Charles as his advisor. I think he's afraid that now that Gabe is an adult and he's found his mate, he really doesn't need him anymore. Val's tone was carefully even. He was being cautious not to let on how he felt about the situation. It made me wonder how he really felt about Charles. Why would my being here mean that Gabe doesn't need him anymore? I wasn't following the logic. You'll be the Luna. Gabe will go to you when he needs help making a decision. Val said simply. That seems too simple of an explanation. I said quietly. Charles looks at me like I'm lower than the dirt under his heels. He hates me. I wrapped my arms around myself and looked away from Val. It wasn't as though no one had looked down on me before, but there was something so much more hateful behind Charles's eye. After the attack, something changed in him, Val said. Charles had always been a boisterous, almost arrogant man. He used to strut around the village like a peacock. If you didn't know better, you'd have thought he was the alpha. Val frowned and crossed his arms as he spoke. He was constantly traveling to meet with the other packs. He was especially close to the alpha of the Bear Lake pack. Charles was part of the reason we were so close to them geographically. They were the closest to us, but it was still strange how intertwined our packs became. Maybe it was because his mate was from there. So it's mother, I said softly. Was she killed in the attack too? Yes, he said solemnly. It's hard to say exactly why he changed so much, but he became very closed off. He didn't want to engage with the outside world at all, not even to defend ourselves. He was content to let the pack dwindle and suffer. I can only guess that the loss of his alpha and his mate sent him into a deep depression. He was listless and diametrically opposed to taking any action that would involve the other packs. When Gabe started meeting with the other alphas, Charles was almost frantic with worry. It was a bizarre reaction, but he must have just been that worried about Gabe. He's overly cautious. Val looked thoughtful as he spoke, as if he were trying to assemble a puzzle that he couldn't see the face of. He frowned and said, "Maybe he's nervous because you come from the human world." He's certainly made it a point to bring that up whenever he can, I said bitterly. That didn't feel sufficient, though. The man lost his alpha and his mate, so I could see why it would shake his world. That didn't explain why he would want me out of the picture. Has he always been protective of Gabe? I asked. The pained expression stole over Val's face. I don't know if that's the right phrase, he said under his breath. I barely heard him say, more like controlling. That got my attention. I sat up and looked at Val's body language. Val seemed so much more laid back than Gabe, but the more I got to know him, the clearer it became that Val was just as good at masking his emotions. He just usually did it behind a smile and not a scowl. Why does Charles have so many meetings with Gabe? I asked suddenly. Val gave me a strange look and I smiled nervously. It's just he's always being called into meetings, and because he's always in meetings, he has to send you to take care of other things. It seems like you two are always working. That's true, Val said with a sigh. Charles is very meticulous. He wants to be involved in everything. But Gabe is the alpha. Shouldn't he be going to Charles if he needs something, and not the other way around? I asked. I leaned forward and watched Val's face closely. Something flashed in his eyes before he looked to the side to avoid my gaze. That's how it typically works, he said. I'm just trying to understand, I said. This is all new to me, but there are some things that don't seem to square with what I've been told about the pack hierarchy. I think it's admirable that Gabe is open to other perspectives. It just seems like Charles can be kind of pushy. That's one way of putting it. Val said, I think that things will change once you're the Luna. He said he looked almost hopeful. You think so? It seems like he and Isolde basically live in the Alpha's house. Val didn't trust Charles either. I could tell by the way his shoulders tensed in as he considered my words. He gave a non-committal hum and sat back. We should get back to work. Right, sorry, I said. It's fine, Val said softly. He grabbed a book from beside him and flipped it open. I did the same, and there was an awkward silence between us for several minutes. I was just starting to get back into the rhythm of this tedious task when Val inhaled sharply. I looked up, startled. What's wrong? I found something, he said, turning the book and shoving it at me. I took it from him and looked at the page. It was a family tree, an extensive one. It went all the way back to the 1800s. I looked over the page, but I couldn't see what Val was talking about. I looked at him in confusion. There's a note in the margin, he said. He knelt in front of me and pointed to a name toward the top of the tree. Esther Brand, born 1820, Sid, died 1874. I read in the margin beside the name, written in faded pencil. There was a note. I read it, then looked at Val and read it again. a rare red wolf. I looked at the book in disbelief, then looked back to Val and smiled. A red wolf, he repeated with a bright smile on his face. I could tell that he was relieved. It was starting to feel like we wouldn't find anything. This wasn't much, but it was a starting point. The door to the library opened and Gabe walked in. He paused for a moment and raised an eyebrow at Val, who was still kneeling in front of me. Val took the book and pushed himself to his feet. He brought it to Gabe. We've just had a breakthrough, he said happily. Gabe looked where Val indicated on the page. It's not exactly a breakthrough, he said. Don't ruin the festive mood. Val complained it took us days to find that much. I'm glad you found something, Gabe said. I'm only disappointed that this is taking so much longer than I expected it to. Val looked annoyed at that, and I couldn't blame him. I stood and walked over to them. We didn't even have a name to start with. I said, I think this is pretty damn impressive. Gabe looked annoyed, but I wasn't sure why. He looked down at the book again, then back at me. Rare, he said softly. That's one word to describe you. What's that supposed to mean? I crossed my arms and tried to look annoyed, but I couldn't hide the smile on my face. Gabe's lips twitched, and I knew he wanted to smile too. I think you know exactly what I mean. Okay, Val said with a sigh. He took the book and brought it back to the table, where he put a bookmark in it. If you two are going to start your weird flirt fighting thing, I'm going home to Lucky. Tell her I said hi. I said, I will, Val promised. He grabbed his jacket and left the room. Gabe shut the door behind him and made his way to me, placing his hand over mine. This is good news. He started. I just don't want you to get your hopes up. I know, I said, it's not much. It may be all I find. But what if that is one of my ancestors? Wouldn't that be incredible? Maybe that's my real last name. I couldn't help but be excited. Estelle Brand sounded pretty good. Real last name, Gabe frowned at me. What do you mean? I don't know my family name. I said, obviously I don't. So I was given a placeholder name. Hospitals kind of assume that a baby will be adopted, so they don't worry too much about that. What name were you given? He asked. I felt my expression sourdough. Gabe's eyebrows raised in surprise. Estelle do. I grimaced yes to as an anonymous, unknown, unclaimed. Gabe grabbed me by the arms and kissed me. The sudden movement silenced me, and I stared at him as he pulled back. You're claimed, he said sternly, and don't you dare forget it. Chapter 28. Be my Luna. I'd hardly seen Gabe in days. He'd been so busy dealing with the other packs that he'd missed dinner every night this week. Besides that, he was trying to figure out the security issues at the border, so he was up early every morning. Most days I was asleep before he came to bed, and he was gone by the time I woke up. I wasn't convinced that he actually made it to bed every night. The biggest obstacle in the relations with the other packs seemed to be Charles. He'd inserted himself into every meeting, not matter how mundane. Based on what Val had told me about him, Charles should have been an asset to the meetings. But Gabe was frustrated by the way things had stalled out. He just couldn't seem to make any progress, and he was becoming increasingly irritated by it. If that wasn't enough to ruin my mood, Isolde had been a constant presence in the house. It seemed like she was lurking in every doorway, as if she were waiting for something to happen. I had no idea what it could be, but I didn't like it. She and Charles had said they were going to find a way to make Gabe leave me. I didn't know what lengths they might go to in order to reach that goal. I didn't trust Isolde. Val and I had agreed to take the day off from our research. We both needed a break from the dull, repetitive work. Val was excited about spending an uninterrupted day with Lucky. It was endearing how much the two of them seemed to genuinely like each other. I was a little jealous of their open affection. I decided to spend the morning catching up with Mame Aida. It had been a long time since I'd visited her. I thought that maybe I could confide in her without worrying about Gabe or Val finding out what we talked about. Mama Ida had never given me a reason to distrust her. The early autumn air was cool, and the smell of rain was lingering from the night before. Part of me wanted to just keep walking and enjoy the fresh air, but Gabe would be distracted if I got too far away. He was in another meeting this morning with the Alpha and Luna of the Lost Lake Pack. It had taken a lot of effort on his part to get them to agree to a meeting. I didn't want to do anything to mess this up for him. When I walked into the inn, Mama Ida was standing behind the counter and going over paperwork of some kind. It looked like her guest logs. I hadn't considered that she was probably playing host to all of the pack delegates that had been in and out of the village in the past week. "Good morning, Mama Ida," I said. She looked up at me and smiled brightly. "Hello, sunshine," she said as she waved me over. "Come on in. I'm just finishing this up." "Keeping busy?" I asked. She chuckled and jotted something on the paper in front of her. "Oh my, yes, busier than I've ever been. Our borders have been closed for so long that I thought I was going to have to shut this place down. Then suddenly, Gabe is welcoming in visitors. You've been a great influence on him." "I'm not sure everyone would agree with you," I muttered. "Now who could have a problem with us coming out from under our sad little rock?" She scoffed. "Charles and I sold," I said uncertainly. I was taking a risk by even bringing them up, and it was hard to put any confidence into my voice. I wanted to sound self-assured, but I was failing. "Oh, those two," she said as she rolled her eyes and waved her hand dismissively. "They're just angry it wasn't their idea."
Mame Ida, can I tell you something in confidence? I asked softly. She looked at me, and the smile froze on her face. I cursed myself for being so easy to read. I had wanted to approach this as casually as possible.
"You can't tell anyone that we had this conversation." I was wringing my hands in front of me, and it was hard to keep looking her in the face. "You can tell me anything," she said sincerely. She closed the notebook she was looking over and reached for my hand. "You look absolutely fraught. Why don't I make us some tea and you can tell me what's on your mind?" She held my hand in hers and looked into my eyes. I nodded. I didn't trust myself to speak just yet. She patted my hand gently, then pointed me toward the back room. I went and sat in the familiar and comfortable armchair near the window. In my first few days in the village, this chair had been a safe space for me. Mama Ida had invited me to play card games with her, and it had become a habit. I hadn't been back since I moved in with Gabe. I should make the effort to come visit for a weekly game night. I think that it would be good for me, and I really missed spending time with Mama Ida.
Yeah.
She came back a few minutes later and sat 2 steaming cups of tea on the table in front of me. "Now, tell me what's going on," she said as she sat down. I took the tea and held it in both hands. It was warm and the scent was comforting. "Isolde is the one that's been spreading rumors about me." It felt weird to say it out loud. It was hardly a bombshell. I knew that at least a few people knew it was her. It still felt like a weight was taken off of my chest. She and Charles are trying to convince Gabe to leave me. "Those two," Mama Ida growled under her breath. "What did Gabe do when you told him?" "I haven't told him," I corrected her. "Why not?" She looked surprised, and it made me feel stupid. "I don't have any proof. I've heard them talking about it, but..." "Why would you need proof?" she asked. "Your word is all the proof that Gabe would need. You must know that." I just shook my head. Gabe wouldn't blindly believe me, not with something like this. Charles and Isolde were basically family, as close as we were getting. He still didn't know me that well. He wouldn't choose me over them. Sunshine, you need to tell him, as the alpha, he needs to know that they're intentionally sowing unrest in the pack. I can't tell him, I said softly. I can't risk that he won't believe me. If he thinks I'm lying, he'll send me away. I had made the mistake of overestimating someone's feelings for me far too many times. I'd been sent away from some of the nicest homes I'd ever stayed at because I'd trusted someone too early. I knew that Gabe wasn't like that, but the fear of losing him was crippling. Mama Ida looked at me with pity, and I had to glance down at my feet. This isn't the way I'd hoped this conversation would go. There has to be something I can do without getting Gabe involved. He's already involved, Estelle, she said. But I don't want him to be. I've been nothing but trouble for him since I got here. He has so much on his plate right now. I can't go to him with this too. She opened her mouth to answer, but was interrupted by the chime of the front door. I'll be right back, she promised. She stood and walked out of the room. A moment later, I smelled cedarwood and knew who had arrived. I took a sip of my tea to ground myself. The strong, earthy flavor was comforting. I stood as Gabe entered the room. Hi, I said weakly. I didn't mean to interrupt. He said he looked stiff for some reason, and I wondered if he'd come looking for me because something was wrong. My concern must have shown on my face because he made a visible effort to relax his shoulders. Is everything all right? I asked. Fine, he said dismissively. I finally got a minute alone, and I've been wanting to talk to you about something, he said quickly. I frowned. Was he nervous? Sir, I said, what's on your mind? Yeah, he said quickly. I raised my eyebrows in surprise. You've been on my mind, he said more calmly. I felt my face starting to heat up. Why's that? Things between us have been good, he said softly. He was nervous. Being away from you the past few days has made me realize how much I value your presence in my life. I want to keep you by my side. That's where I want to stay, I said softly. I felt like I belonged with him. There was nowhere else I'd rather be. I didn't understand the nerves I could detect in his voice. A smile flashed across his face. Then I don't see any reason to deep delay. It clicked. I knew where this was going, and my heart was pounding against my ribs. I wished I could walk away right now and get some air. I wasn't ready to hear this. Estelle, he said softly. He stepped forward and took my hands in his. I want to make you my Luna. I felt my eyes go wide and my breath catch in my throat. Gabe looked at me expectantly, but I couldn't find my voice. Of course I wanted to be with him, but the weight of the responsibility that came with the title of Luna was crushing. Your Luna. Hua, I said breathlessly. He released my hands slowly and looked at me closely. I must have been pale as a ghost. My fight or flight response was in overdrive, and I was frozen. I tried to find the words to express what I was feeling. I could see Gabe's expression changing. My hesitation was distressing him. Gabe, I don't know what to say. Say yes, he said, his brows knit. As he looked at me, he was getting upset. I reached for him, but he stepped away from me. My heart hurt. I couldn't be the Luna. I wasn't ready. I hadn't won the pack over yet. I hadn't learned what I needed to learn. I hadn't even told him that I loved him. God, I really loved him, and I was hurting him right now. This is the last thing I wanted. I was stuck in my head. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't speak. I think I was in shock. I don't understand. He said his expression was guarded. What's the problem? It's not that, I said. My voice was so soft that he probably couldn't even hear me. Damn it, if I could just find the confidence to tell him what I'm thinking. I was frozen by my self-doubt, and it was going to ruin everything. Gabe stared at me, and I watched as his expression shifted. His eyes went cold, and he took a step away from me. I see, he said. This was a mistake. I'll go now. I wanted to call out for him as he turned and vanished around through the door, but I couldn't. All I could do was watch him leave. Chapter 29, Sleeping with the Babe. Gabe. Estelle's face drained of color as she stared up at me. Her eyes were watery, and she parted her lips. She didn't speak. She looked completely stunned. It wasn't at all the reaction I'd anticipated when I asked her to be my Luna. I thought that she would be surprised, but the horror on her face was hard to accept. I'd spent days with the idea of making her the Luna playing in my mind. It was all I could think about. The droning meetings that I was trapped in were only bearable because of Estelle. The thought of her skin against mine and her voice in the dark got me through the interminable diplomatic discussion. She was usually sleeping peacefully by the time I made it to our bed, and I didn't have the heart to wake her. My desire for her was only tempered by the way she curled into my touch. The moment I joined her under the blanket, even if it was subconsciously, she still reached for me, and it made my heart sink. She distracted me, but I couldn't bring myself to care. Having her scent lingering throughout the house brought me comfort, and knowing that she was just down the hall in the library brought me peace. It was clear to me that Estelle was meant to be mine. I wanted to solidify that fact, not only to her, but to the world. I don't understand, I said out loud. She was staring at me like she was afraid to make a move. A lot of people looked at me with fear in their eyes, but seeing it from my mate hurt more than I could have guessed. What's the problem? I asked. It's not that. She said weakly. Her hand moved as if she were going to reach for me, but she refrained. The slight aborted movement felt like a rejection. I see, I said. I cleared my throat and made an effort to remove any expression from my face. I couldn't let anyone see me feeling so vulnerable. This was a mistake. I'll go. I should have known better than to surprise my skittish mate with such a proposal. I'd frightened her. This was the last thing I wanted. I stepped away from her. She'd hardly taken a breath since I'd asked. I wanted to give her room to breathe. Estelle opened her mouth and a pained sound escaped before she stammered a string of disorganized consonants. I'd upset her so much that she couldn't speak. A strange sensation twisted in my gut. I turned and walked away from her. Amemi Ida moved toward me, but I breezed by her and stormed onto the street. Rage was quickly working its way to the top of the confusing emotions that were building within me. It was a familiar comfort in this moment. I clenched my hands at my sides and made my way quickly toward home. I didn't know how I might react if someone tried to approach me right now. I needed to get as far from Estelle as I dared. Her sweet scent was evoking the image of her terrified eyes, and it made something deep within me shudder. I banged the front door of the house open and strode to my office. There were people in the hallways, but I didn't stop to see who, and they didn't dare approach me. The heavy door slammed behind me, and I grabbed the nearest object, a table lamp, and hurled it against the wall. The sound of shattering glass was obscenely satisfying. I fucked up. Why did I think that it was a good idea to approach her like that? Had I learned nothing about her in the time she'd been here? How could I be so impulsive? My chest felt tight and my breathing was becoming ragged. It took far too long for me to realize that I was starting to cry. I was horrified. I couldn't remember the last time I'd cried. I couldn't display that kind of fragility. I had to keep a cool head and a strong demeanor. The protection of the pack was my responsibility. If I displayed this kind of weakness, it could result in untold damage. If Estelle really had this kind of hold on me, maybe it was good that she hadn't accepted. If I made her my Luna, her hold on me would only increase. She could already reduce me to this with a teary look, and I hadn't even given her the mate mark yet. I was a fool. This was not the time to be overwhelmed by my emotions. There were far too many things in flux. I needed to be focused. I needed to stay strong. I was risking everything because I couldn't control myself. I looked down at the shattered lamp on the ground, and a deep sense of shame settled over me. Crying wasn't acceptable, but these displays of violence that she was eliciting from me were hardly better. I wasn't a child throwing a tantrum. I needed to get a handle on the way I was reacting to things. Estelle hadn't done anything wrong. She was afraid. I should have expected that. She had been skittish the whole time I'd known her. She was sensitive about the topic of her family history, and it had been at the forefront of her mind for days now. I was being thoughtless. I closed my eyes and tried to focus on my breathing. I just needed to calm down. I could fix things. With Estelle, I just needed to give her time to think over what I'd asked. I shouldn't have expected an immediate answer. My heart was starting to calm. I took another deep breath. The smell of candy apples announced Isolde's approach, and I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from screaming. I tasted blood. Gabe, the door creaked open slowly. The growl that escaped me was much harsher than I meant it to be. Estelle had the bad habit of showing up when I was pissed off. What the hell gave her the idea that I was a man who needed to be comforted was beyond me. I fixed her with a withering glare and waited for her to either speak her piece or leave. She stepped toward me cautiously. "I'm sorry. I know that this is a bad time," she said softly. I can tell that you're upset." "What do you want?" She took a deep breath and folded her arms in front of her. "I really don't want to be the one that has to tell you this, but you need to know."
I am not in the mood for games or theatrics. Say what you need to say or get out of my sight.
The emotions roiling in my chest were making me feel sick, and I did not want anyone near me, especially not someone I found so irritating. She swallowed thickly and released an uneven breath. "I wouldn't tell you this if I didn't care about you," she said shakily. "I think that something is going on between Val and Estelle." "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" I demanded. She looked into my eyes but quickly looked away. I must have looked half crazed to elicit that kind of reaction quietly, but firmly, she said. "I think that they're having an affair." Before I could fully process her words, I was moving toward her. The rage that flooded through me was completely overwhelming. It took every bit of self-discipline I had to regain control. "I'm sorry." She backed away from me and reached blindly for the door. I grabbed her wrist and yanked her back to me. "Do not walk away from me when I'm talking to you." And my voice was low, and even I was doing my best to keep my anger in check, that I was failing. I didn't want to hurt her. I released her wrist and she hugged it against her chest. I could see tears gathering in her dark eyes. "Why?" I demanded. "Why do you think that?" She swallowed her fear. I walked into the library and found them very close together. I think that I interrupted something. They're just spending so much time alone together. The image of Val kneeling in front of Estelle with his hand on her leg flashed through my mind, and I growled. Jealousy had shot through me when I'd walked in on them like that, but it had been innocent. It must have been. "Tell me exactly what you saw," I said slowly. Isolde looked uncertain and lowered her eyes. I grabbed her jaw and made her look me in the face. "Tell me." She stammered and couldn't hold eye contact. She shut her eyes tightly. "You're hurting me." "Liar." I let go of her. "Get out." "No, I'm not." "Out." I screamed. She tripped over her feet and hit her shoulder on the doorframe as she ran. I was angry, but that wasn't the emotion that was threatening to overwhelm me. The pain in my chest was so intense that I had to sit down. I collapsed into the nearest chair and ran my fingers through my hair. She was lying. She had to be. I would trust Val with my life. He was completely in love with Lucky, and I knew that he would never betray her. I knew that I could trust him with Estelle. That was why I'd asked him to take on the task of uncovering her history. In the nearly 2 decades we'd been friends, he had never given me any indication that he couldn't be trusted. That was more than I could say for Estelle. I trusted Estelle too. She'd given me no reason to doubt her. The way she looked at me was so full of affection. How could it be feigned? How could someone who looked at me like that be unfaithful? I didn't believe it. But Estelle's hesitation when I'd asked her to be my Luna was fresh in my mind. I could still see the panic in her eyes as she'd stared up at me. She'd frozen as though the idea overwhelmed her mind so badly that she couldn't move. She was skittish. I knew that. I'd sprung it on her. That was all there was to it. But she crawled into bed with the faint scent of sandalwood and pine sap clinging to her. Were the hours spent sitting beside Val in the library really enough for his scent to linger on her? Like, that was the mental load of digging through old records enough to account for her exhaustion. No rational part of me would believe that either of them would do such a thing. But the moment the idea entered my mind, it stuck, and I knew that no amount of rationalizing would get rid of it. Was Estelle really sleeping with my beta? Chapter 30, Bare Leg. Estelle. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt so awful about anything in my life. Gabe was so upset with me that he hadn't come to bed last night. I'd waited up for him for hours. I couldn't blame him, really. He basically proposed to me, and I just stared at him like an idiot. I wanted to find him and apologize, but I was afraid that I'd freeze up again. I was terrified of being the Luna, but I was more scared of losing Gabe. Mama Ida had comforted me the best she could after Gabe stormed out. She was kind about the situation, but it was clear that she was disappointed in me. I was too. I don't know why it was so hard for me to find my voice. All I had to do was tell him the truth. I wanted to be his Luna, but I was afraid I'd mess it up. Gabe would understand that he'd been forced to become the alpha before he was ready. Then again, maybe he'd think I was being a baby since he'd been so much younger than me when he took on those responsibilities. It was all so much to try to process. I could smell him nearby, and it was making it hard not to cry. Sleeping without him last night was impossible, and the lack of rest was only making me feel more emotional. I wanted to tell him that I loved him, but I was afraid that he'd think I was just saying it because he was mad. I didn't want the first time I told him to be out of duress. I loved him so much. It scared me. I never thought another person would have so much importance to me. Without Gabe, I didn't know who I was anymore. I'd do anything to stay by his side. The fact that I felt this way was frightening in and of itself. Nothing mattered to me as much as keeping Gabe safe and making him happy. I needed to find a way to make it up to him. I almost asked Val, but I was too embarrassed to explain what had happened. I'm not sure I could have discussed it without crying. Anyway, Val was in a much better mood after spending the day with Lucky. He dug into the records with a renewed sense of purpose this morning. Unfortunately, his efforts so far had been in vain. Brand seemed like a common enough name, but the records available to us were spotty and incomplete. According to Val, a lot of information had been lost due to the attack. The pack suffered from the Bear Lake pack. The library had burned. The more I learned about the attack, the more horrified I was. What could have prompted such viciousness? Val was getting us coffee, so for now, I was alone in the library. It was impossible to keep my mind from wandering as I flipped through family trees in search of the name brand. All I could think about was Gabe. The way he'd closed off to me yesterday broke my heart. I didn't realize how much more open he'd become with me until he withdrew again. I'd started to earn his trust and I screwed it all up. I tossed one book aside and reached for a loosely bound sheaf of papers. I was starting to feel like this entire thing was pointless. We were never going to find out who my family was. The dreams might be related to the strange activity following me, but we weren't going to find answers this way. I flipped through the papers listlessly. It looked like various loose papers had been hastily put together, and there was no discernible rhyme or reason to the way they were organized. It was mostly composed of hand-drawn family trees. I recognized some of the surnames as families in the past. I turned the page and froze. I had to rub my eyes to make sure I wasn't seeing wrong. Celeste Brand, 1924-1985, married to Anthony Delvey, 1920-1985. They had one child, a son named Russell. I gasped out loud. I knew him. It was Russ. The old woodcarver I'd met at the craft fair, and the father of Russ, who ran the restaurant in the village. I was so excited I clutched the book to my chest and rushed out of the library. I had to find Val. In my rush, I tripped on the edge of the hall rug and fell forward. I was braced to hit the ground, but a strong arm caught me around my waist and pulled me upright. "What are you doing?" Gabe demanded. His scent overwhelmed me for a moment, and I stared up at him. Just a few hours away from him was too much. I smiled. "I was just looking for Val," I said. "I found Val," he growled. "I thought he was already with you." There was a strange intonation in his voice. I tilted my head and frowned at him. He went to get coffee, but I just found something and I didn't want to wait to show him. I held the book out to Gabe and pointed at the name. "See, I don't care what you found." He glared down at me in irritation. I was taken aback by the anger on his face. I knew that he must still be angry, but this seemed like an extreme reaction. I must have hurt him more than I realized. I felt the smile leave my face, Gabe, out yesterday. He shook his head at me. Then he turned and walked away without a word. It stung. The book dropped to my side as I watched him walk away. I told myself that it was okay. He was still upset and needed time, but I'd be able to talk it out with him soon. I told myself that, but I didn't believe it. Something was wrong. The look in Gabe's eyes was stone cold. It felt like I was looking at a stranger. I don't know how long I stood there before I heard Val approaching behind me. "Estelle, are you all right? What are you standing in the hallway for?" he asked. I forced a smile onto my face and turned to look up at him. "I was just coming to find you. I found something." I handed him the book and pointed out Selete's name. Val handed me a cup of coffee, then took the book in his free hand. He looked it over for a moment, then smiled at me. "That's great. He said we can talk to Russ and see if he knows anything about his mother's family." "Can we go now?" I asked. I was excited to find out more, but I also wanted to get a little distance from Gabe. Our interaction made me uneasy, and I needed to clear my head. "Sure," Val said. "I don't see why not." He handed the book back to me and took a sip of his coffee. Getting a break from those dusty books is very welcome. We left the house and headed toward the village. I followed Val, but I wasn't really paying attention to where we were going. My wolf was upset, and I was trying to find a way to calm it. The distressed whining was making it hard for me to think. We stopped at a small house near the inn and Val knocked at the door. A moment later, it swung open and Russ SR smiled up at us. To what do I owe the honor? He asked. We were hoping that you could help us with some research. Val said, we're looking into some of the family history of the pack and we came across a name in your family tree that we didn't see in any other. Oh, I'd be happy to talk about that, he said with a chuckle. Please come in and excuse the mess. We walked inside and followed Russ into a small living room. Every flat surface was cluttered with blocks of wood, chisels, and other tools, and the floor was dusted with wood shaving. It was a little messy, but it smelled wonderful. I sat in an armchair and Val sat beside Russ on the couch. He handed the book to him. Russ looked the page over fondly. Oh, it's a little out of date, but it looks accurate, he said. Well, who's got the unique name? Your mother, Celeste, Val said, pointing to the page. We've only seen the name brand in one other record. Russ nodded slowly and ran his fingers over the page. Mama was a unique lady, he said. You know, she had golden orange hair, a lot like yours, Estelle. Really, I leaned forward. Maybe we really were on the right track. I tried to keep my excitement in check, but it was difficult. Do you know where your mother was from? I asked. A strange look passed over his face and he sighed deeply. He looked pained as he handed the book back to Val. She was from Bear Lake, he said quietly. Val patted him firmly on the shoulder. There's no shame in that, he said. Russ gave him a watery smile and patted his hand. I know, he said, it's just painful to think of all the family we lost. I used to spend every summer at Bear Lake with my cousins. It was beautiful. I'm sure it was, Val said kindly. There were these lovely flowers that the Luna had planted. They were white as snow and spread like wildfire. I've never seen any like them around here. They had 5 pointed petals, just like a star. I stared at Val wide-eyed. The flowers he described perfectly matched the bouquet that had been left in the forest. A star, Val asked. Russ nodded and stood slowly. He walked to a nearby workbench and shifted a few sculptures around. When he turned back toward us, he was holding a delicately carved facsimile of a balloon flower. He handed it to Val. You give that to your mate, he said. She's a sweet girl, and I know she likes flowers. Val turned it over in his hands and looked at it closely. It's beautiful, he said. She'll love it. Thank you. Thank you, Russ said firmly. You do a lot for this pack. We'd be lost without you. Val looked genuinely moved and stood. He held his hand out to Russ, and they clasped arms. I appreciate that. I'm afraid we have to get going. Don't be strangers, he said. We left, and the moment we were alone, I looked at Val. I'm from the Bear Lake Pack. Most likely, he said. His attention was on the flower carving. I'm more concerned that our mystery gift giver is probably from Bear Lake. Gabe told me there were rumors that the pack was still around, I said softly. Val nodded thoughtfully. It might be more than a rumor. I didn't know how to feel. I was glad to have an answer about where my parents were likely from, but the idea that someone from Bear Lake had breached our borders was concerning. I didn't even want to think about how Gabe was going to react to the news. Are you sure you want to keep pulling at this thread? Val asked. I thought about the dreams I'd been having. Whoever the dreams were coming from, they were scared and they knew who was chasing them. I had to be getting these visions for a reason. If I ignored it and put the pack in danger, I'd never forgive myself. We have to keep looking. This part is ended. Thank you for listening. If you would like to continue listening to the next part, please let me know by leaving a comment.